This is chapter 19, part 2. We're in the expansion of Europe in the 18th century, dealing with economic issues. We've already looked at the expansion of agriculture and food supply. We then looked at the expansion of the population. Finally, in the last section, we reviewed the expansion of work opportunities through this thing called cottage industry. And now in this final section, we see the expansion of the world economy, the Atlantic economy, they call it. We'll also see the outcome of that, which were the development of major rivalries between England and pretty much everyone else in Europe, the expansion of war because of those economic rivalries, and the expansion of the slave trade across the Atlantic as well. So all this new expansion of population, food supply, and work leads to the expansion of the global economy in the 18th century, dominated ultimately by England. That's the first thing. Which country takes the dramatic lead in terms of economic growth in the 18th century? It's the British, Great Britain, or England. They become the dominant power in the world at this point, replacing the Dutch maybe, definitely, and then prior to that the Dutch having replaced the Spanish. So it kind of, you got to know who's on top in each century. All right, let's review the main economic system that was being practiced at this time, which is called mercantilism, which is the English were all about. The Dutch were about this too. This is where you want to have a favorable balance of trade. It's the directing of all economic activities by and for the nation, by and for the state. You want to export more than you import. You want to accumulate gold and wealth, all for the nation, for the good of the government, not the good of the people, the good of the country. Okay, this is what mercantilism is all about. You don't want to trade with people. You want to make everything yourself and sell it to the world. And in order to do that, you need colonies so that you can get raw materials from them and then turn around and turn those materials into finished goods and sell them everywhere else. All right, that's mercantilism. It's a sort of a selfish form of economic system that benefits the nation, not necessarily the individual. And that's going to get challenged here at the end of this section by capitalism. All right, let's skip number 2 about how does British mercantilism differ from the French. Let's not worry about that. The Navigation Acts, by the way, look at this map here. This is the Atlantic economy. It's a little hard to read, some of the fine print, but you see there's this whole system of products that goes from Europe over to the New World. It comes from Africa. You can see slaves are being transported from Africa to the New World. Sugar is going over to Europe. Coffee, silver, tobacco, wood, all that goes from the New World back to Europe. And then, of course, manufactured goods, that's what they want to sell. That goes from Europe back to North America and the rest of the world. The Navigation Acts are a set of laws passed by the English Parliament that support their mercantilism in practice. And really, the Navigation Acts are a form of economic warfare laid against every other country in Europe. So here's the terms of the Navigation Acts that, again, are they're totally linked to mercantilism. Everything brought to England must be carried on a British ship. All goods that are traded and bought by or sold by English people have to be on a British-controlled ship, run by British citizens. Okay? This creates a monopoly on trade with the British colonies. Nobody else in the world is permitted by the Navigation Acts, essentially, to trade with British colonies like the North American colonies, because no one else runs a British ship or has citizens that control British ships. So this is a monopoly. The British are trying to monopolize trade with their colonies and take raw materials and then sell back the finished goods to the rest of the world. This also expands British sea power. Okay? They're trying to take the trade away from the Dutch, as you see on the notes here. This is all aimed at the Dutch. Remember, the Dutch were the traders and shippers of Europe, and they did everyone's work, transporting goods across the world. The British want to get a piece of that action, and they passed the Navigation Acts specifically for their colonies. Now, the Dutch had been running goods back and forth for decades already, so they're going to get really mad at this, because this is now, again, the British trying to cut into Dutch trade. So this is going to lead to a series of wars called the Anglo-Dutch Wars. 22 years of warfare. Basically, these are economic wars. Write that down in the margin here. This is about who's going to control Atlantic trade. And the Dutch launched a war against the English because of the Navigation Acts. As part of that, there's going to be some territorial adjustments. And before we get into that, just take a look at this little picture here and how the Navigation Acts enforce mercantilism. And there's all sorts of taxes that are a part of it, where the British government is making tax revenue by only having things on British ships. Okay, so just study this chart for a little bit, and then we're going to move on. The Anglo-Dutch Wars. So part of this translates into warfare. Mercantilism always tends to end up in wars because people aren't doing business with each other. They're just trying to take more of the rest of the world for themselves. So as part of this, the English conquered the Dutch colony in the New World, which was New Amsterdam. This was one of the major Dutch settlements, colonies in North America. And when the English captured it in 1674, they renamed it New York. So New York City was originally, if you didn't know this, a Dutch colony. And if you go down to lower Manhattan today, you'll see all the remnants of the former Dutch colony, like around Battery Park. There's a big fortress there that was an old Dutch fort. But that was brief, and now it's now and forever called New York, named after the Duke of York, who actually was James II, the guy that got overthrown in the Glorious Revolution. He was the very Duke of York that New York is named after. So how about that one? So this is it. The Dutch are out. The English are on top. They start to fall behind economically. The English are going to take the lead. There's going to be more wars now, fought for a variety of political and economic reasons. These are known as the Anglo-French Wars. Again, between England and France, they go on for 62 years. What are they going to decide? Who's going to be the world leader, at least of Europe, based out of Europe? Who's going to be the leading sea power of the Atlantic Ocean? The Dutch are out now. It's between the British and the French. And the British are going to come up big in all three of these wars. There's three separate wars that all involve Britain and France. There's the War of Spanish Succession, which France lost. You'll remember that. So did Spain. But the English win. And the English gained territories in the New World like Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the Hudson Bay that had all been French stuff. They took that. The British gained the asiento, which is the slave trade that had been previously controlled by the Spanish. Remember, the Spanish and Portuguese were really the leaders in establishing the slave trade. Now the British, as part of the terms of that treaty, the Peace of Utrecht, remember that one? The British gained control of the slave trade. So this is big. This is all pro-Britain. The War of Austrian Succession was very complicated. It dealt with people in Europe challenging Maria Theresa, ascending to the throne of Austria. They said she can't have it. She's a woman. They disputed the pragmatic sanction that had been passed from before. Anyway, this was another war in Europe that the British got involved in, fighting against the French, as well as the Austrians fighting the Prussians again over and the Prussians taking Silesia. Remember that? That's all part of this war. Kind of complicated. The results, though, are that the English have another little round of fighting against the French, and there's no change in territory in Europe. It's the least important of the three wars. The most important is the 7 Years' War, which is fought in Europe and in North America. And in North America, it's called the French and Indian War, and in Europe, it's known as the 7 Years' War. It's the same. It's almost a world war. Okay, the opponents in Europe, Austria and France, are on the same side. England and Prussia are on the same side. Austria is trying to take back Silesia from Prussia. England and Prussia had been allies several times, so they maintain an alliance. France takes the side of Austria, which is a reversal. Remember how many years the French tried to stick it to the Habsburgs and never fought with them and supported anyone else in Europe but them? Political things have changed. Now it's in their best interest, they thought, to join the Austrians. And in North America, England is fighting France. England wants Canada, which at this point, up until this point, had been French. So it's a huge battle all across the world. The British come up big and win the 7 Years' War. There's a whole story of this that plays out in terms of why are the French making alliances with North Indians and to fight the colonists in America. You'll save that for U.S. history. Don't worry about that. But this thing culminates in the Treaty of Paris, 1763. And here's a good map to see. Look at this now. The whole colonial situation in North America changed. France lost all possessions in mainland North America, essentially, to Britain. Canada and all land of the east of the Mississippi, as you can see, went to Britain. Louisiana went to Spain a little bit. A little bit. Look at that green, Spanish territory. See that? The Spanish expanded. The British expanded. Just study this map for a minute here. This is huge. Look at all that orange from 1754. That's all French. And then look at how much green and purple, which is now Spanish and British. Okay, incredible stuff here. This is now the decisive battle. And why does this matter? Because that's where all the raw materials are going to come from in the colonies to go back to England. England's going to use mercantilism to become the global economic leader. All right. However, just about 13 years after this treaty is signed, the American Revolution starts in 1776. And it's completely related to these developments because once the British took over all of North America east of the Mississippi, they sort of tightened the screws on these colonists in North America, and they demanded more tax money. They enforced the Navigation Acts. Now, American colonists wanted to trade with everyone in the world. They wanted to trade with France and Spain and the Dutch, and now the English are coming in with a stronghold saying everything you do is centered through us in the Navigation Acts, and so there's going to be smuggling. The Americans are going to smuggle things and break the Navigation Acts, and the British are going to respond with more taxes and crackdowns and laws. And all of that economic stuff then also into the political stuff in terms of liberty being violated and all that, no taxation without representation. All that's going to culminate in the American War of Revolution, just 14 years down the road from right at this point. So this is big stuff in the world scale, okay? And that's listed there in your notes, the American War of Revolution. And the French are going to show up to help us in that revolution to try to get back at the British. So this stuff just goes on and on. But the main point here is that the British emerge as the dominant economic and military and political power now in Europe as a result of a whole century worth of economic war. All right, let's go on. English trade grows as a result of winning all these wars. Okay, the growth of English trade. England starts to lose its trade in Europe with its European partners. So continental Europe cut into trade within Europe. But colonial trade is what replaces it. So that's the key here. Colonial trade is going to grow dramatically. From 500,000 pounds is the British currency up to 4 million pounds in just a short period of time. So England is losing its trading partners in Europe, but that's okay. They don't really want to trade anyway. They want to sell stuff, take raw materials from the colonies and sell it back to the colonies as finished goods. English mercantilism, as you can see through these wars, achieved dramatic success. So the growth in colonial trade is directly related to these wars. Also on the rise is the Atlantic slave trade. And this is now the second time this has been talked about, I think, and we had it a couple chapters ago. But the growth of the Atlantic slave trade is really huge here. So between 1701 and 1800, 6 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic as labor. 80,000 per year was the early averages. Look at that. It's incredible. Look at this map of where they ended up. And the volume of it. You can see most of the slaves actually ended up in South America. And then second place would be the Caribbean. And third place is actually up into British North America. So you can see that. Just incredible. The number of people that went and how they did it. Amazing. Directed by the British. Remember, they got that control from the Spanish. It got intense, the intensification of the slave trade in the 18th century. There was the shore method. It was called the shore method, where local African leaders would round up enemies from within other tribes or different groups in Africa and bring them right to the shore so that Europeans just literally could bring their boats up and load up the slaves and transport them across. The Europeans didn't even have to do the dirty work, so to speak, of rounding people up. They had, they had partnerships with local rulers who were willing to do this for money, of course. Britain was the undisputed leader in the slave trade. I already mentioned here how African leaders are complicit in the process and do much of the work of rounding up slaves from the African interior. Within Africa, slavery is a punishment for all kinds of petty crimes. So this is part of the justice system within Africa, is that when you break laws, you can be basically put into slavery and sold off to Europeans as punishment for any crime that you might have committed. You'll notice that there's no arrows pointing up to Europe. Very few slaves from Africa ended up in Western Europe. You don't have that in England or France or Spain. It's a few taken as sort of novelties and luxury goods, but the slave trade is all between Africa and the Americas. Very quickly, you can hear, there's something else you need to know, another term here. You need to know the term triangle trade. This is an important concept as part of the Atlantic slave trade, and you can see it's a triangle of what goes where. Slaves go from Africa to the West Indies or the New World. Raw materials then go from North America and Central America back to Europe, and manufactured goods go from Europe back to everywhere else. So this is the triangle trade, and it is the Atlantic economy for the better part of a century, the 18th century. Thankfully, the British got it together. There was a huge movement in England starting right around 1775 to stop the slave trade. Britain is the first nation in the world that leads a campaign to stop the slave trade. Now, the government of Britain was running it, but a movement emerged within England from the people to stop it. And it took place over about 25 years, from 1775 to about 1800, and it's called the British Anti-Slavery Society, and you can see that on this little emblem here. This is British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, and it's the first mass political movement in British history, actually. This is their cause, to stop slavery and at least the slave trade. The role of women in this was really important. This was led by groups of middle class and upper class women, and it's kind of their first adventure into politics. Women don't have the right to vote yet, but this movement is going to start the process of women being politically active in Europe, and of course that's going to culminate in the suffrage movement, the demand for the right to vote. But this is the beginning of women's political activism in European history, the anti-slavery movement. The British Parliament abolished the slave trade in 1807, the first major Western nation to do that. So the British took the lead, of course, in stopping it. The Spanish and Portuguese started it, the British then took it over, but were the first to end it. All right, last but not least, we'll get into the theory of economic liberalism put out by Adam Smith. This is also known as the theory of capitalism. This is the expansion of capitalism. We've already seen the expansion of trade, the expansion of the slave trade, and now here comes a new form of economic theory to replace mercantilism eventually. And Adam Smith is the man. And so Adam Smith's theory is a reaction against mercantilism. Okay? Merchants don't like being regulated by the government. All these regulations that the government puts on as part of mercantilism and all the different rules of trade are expensive. And the business people, the merchants, resist this. There's a better way, they said. They called, and Adam Smith called, for free trade. Let us do business with whoever we want in the world. If we want to buy products from the Dutch, because the Dutch make them better, great. I don't want to have to just buy and sell from the American colonies only. This is primarily in England this theory develops, because the English were so tightly controlling their economy at this point. This is an opposing worldview that centers on the individual as the center of the economic system. It starts with the individual, not the nation. And the individual is the hub of all economic activity. And when we empower individuals to do what they do best and find a specialty and learn a trade or own a business and be really good at it and make a profit, it's going to benefit all of us as a nation. And the government can step back. The government takes a laissez-faire approach, which means let it be. Instead of managing the entire economy, the theory of capitalism put out in the book Wealth of Nations, that's the name of the book, 1776, same year as the American Revolution, says that the role of the government is to back away and repeal the Navigation Acts, repeal all these regulations, and let people do what they're best at, and let people trade. Okay? In the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith called for a very limited role of the government. Only three things: defend against foreign invasion. This is like national defense. Two, maintain civil order with courts and police. Basically, protect the innocent, punish the wicked, that kind of a thing. And the third is to sponsor certain public works projects and institutions that would not be profitable for a business to operate, like massive road building on a huge scale. No business is going to take on that challenge. Even things like universities, that's not really, we don't really want a business. So all that is going to be done by the government. But everything else, excuse that interruption, very narrow role for the government. Okay, you'll hear this a lot by Republicans today, conservatives that want to scale back the role of the government. They say we are like Adam Smith. We want more free trade and less government regulation. And of course, there's a counterpoint to this too, and we'll get to that later on in history when we look at the socialist movement, for example. So Adam Smith said that when people act in their self-interest, that means you want to make a living. You want to do something, have a job, make a good living at it, learn a skill. You're acting in your own self-interest. When you do that, you're not thinking about the good of society as a whole. You're thinking about you. I got to put food on the table, provide for a family, I need to learn something, learn a skill, and do it. When I do that, I'm actually helping the entire community that I live in. For example, if you want to be a doctor and you want to make a lot of money, which is great, and you learn the skill of being a doctor, you've benefited yourself by making a good living for yourself, by having a good skill and being at the cutting edge of your field, and you've also benefited the community around you by doing something really well that other people need. This is the theory of capitalism, and no government agency had to get in there and tell you what to do, which they would have done under mercantilism. They would have regulated every aspect of trade. But now you're operating as an individual and not as the government tells you to. And you're directed by this thing called the invisible hand. This is one of his theories. He goes, by promoting his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intended to promote it. People are directed by an invisible hand to pursue what they by profit, pursue a career, and when you want to make society better, the best thing you can do is go do something for yourself to make a living and learn a trade and be good at it. And no one had to really tell you how to do that. This is kind of a complicated issue, but he said people are directed by this invisible hand to specialize in things, and when you do that, you actually make the world better. Instead of when you actually set out to make the world better through charity work or something like that, Adam Smith is we call him a classical liberalist, a classical liberal theory. That's the name of his theory. That's also known as capitalism, but it's also called classical liberalism. The world is better when capitalism thrives. This is the theory. There's holes in it. You're going to see the opposing forces later on, but for right now, let's just stick with the theory on its merits. All right? So this is going to challenge mercantilism. In America, the colonists are going to love this idea, and they're going to help, it's going to promote war against England and breaking away and establishing capitalism and free enterprise as the foundation of American business. It's going to take a little bit longer to take root in Europe. It's not going to really take, some people might argue it's never really taken full hold in Europe, but it's certainly going to be at least into the early to mid 1800s in the Industrial Revolution. That's when capitalism is going to fully replace mercantilism as the dominant theory in England and then moving on to other countries as well. So that's chapter 19, the expansion of Europe in many ways: population, food, work opportunities, trade, business, and we finish up with the beginning of this new form of economics called capitalism.